Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Thanks very much, Merlin, for that introduction. And very pleased to be here at this conference. It has a very good reputation, is well known across the country and in the industry. And thanks to people like Merlin and Gary and others who in the past have organized this. Until you put on a conference, in regular meetings like this, you don't really realize how much time it takes. And as somebody else who's put them on, I'd like to say thank them on behalf of all the industry who benefit from their efforts to bring this information to you. So I'm going to talk about work we've been doing in the last 10 years on sow nutrition. Give you a little bit about kind of the current status, the background metabolism of changes in sow and fetal growth, which mean we need to change the requirements, our actual data on amino acid requirements. I'm going to skip the energy thing because I'm going to run out of time. I think there's some interest in a discussion of the new NRC model for sows, and then I'll give you some practical feeding recommendations that you can take home and use. How do we feed pigs? I first got involved in the pig industry in 1974 when I became a feed salesman for Cargill. Like many of you, I was out pounding the country roads selling feed. Pig feed was really easy to sell then. You had an 18% starter and a 16% hog grower. That was it. And many of them fed the 16% hog grower to their sows. They had a few bags of 18% starter and the rest was, or they used a supplement, made one feed. I mean, some of the senior scientists in here, senior people, people like Don and Gary and others will remember that's how we used to feed pigs. You wouldn't even think. They'd throw you off the farm and kick your ass all the way to the main highway if you went in and suggested that they could feed a 16% hog grower all the way from 50 pounds to market weight. Right? You now use 5, maybe 6 different feeds just for a grow finish pig. Because he's not the same pig when he's just after weaning as he is as an early grower, as he is a mid grower, as he is the finisher pig. It's not the same pig. He has different diet requirements. So why on earth, why on God's little green earth do you still feed sows one diet? It is metabolically and nutritionally incorrect, just as incorrect as feeding a 16% hog grower to every pig in the barn. So why do you do it? Because we've always done it that way. And for the very same reasons that I get when I say that I heard in 1974 why they shouldn't feed multiple diets to grow finished pigs. Oh, I don't have room for another bin. Oh, I have to keep several formulations. My mill, I got to change the calibration of my mill to make a different diet. Oh, that's too much trouble, right? So the very same things that we said a long time ago about grow finished pigs that now are gone way down the road are still the same excuses we're giving for why we're not feeding sows properly. So I hope by the end of this, I've convinced you that we need to make the effort and the investment to change our feeding programs for sows the very same way we have adapted and changed our feeding programs to optimize productivity and economic output of grow finished pigs. That's my rant. Now I hope to prove that to you. There's been huge changes in pig metabolism. Intensive genetic selection for growth rate, low back fat, feed efficiency have changed the underlying biochemistry and metabolism of the pig. We have greater lean body mass, we have decreased body fat, we have an increased protein deposition rate. This has changed the basal metabolism of pigs and sows. Where do pigs come from? They got to come from the sow. It's the only other way to get that I know of to get them. So the same metabolism has to change in the sow. And we haven't kept up with those changes in metabolism of the sow in our nutrition. So we have increased heat production in sows, increased rate of protein turnover per kilo body weight. So that means increased requirements for energy and amino acids per kilo body weight for sows. There's no other conclusion if you believe biochemistry works. What about litter size in sows? Absolutely dramatic changes in litter size in the last 10 or 12 years. For 50 years, we went along at 10 or 11 pigs per sow, literally 50 years, with no change in litter size. Then, better genetic selection methods, right, bringing in some Asian breeds, and we're going up like this. We're changing litter size of 1 pig every 3 years. We're getting 1 extra pig per litter. And I don't see this stopping anytime soon. In our farm, we're already dropping, our 3rd and 4th parity sows are dropping 15 live-born pigs. This is going to continue. We cannot feed this sow the same way we fed that sow and expect her to perform. Brian was talking about a problem with low birth weight pigs. I mean, you can't feed a sow and get 10 good pigs and feed her the same way and expect to get 15 good pigs. And we all know, having been in the barns, what the negative effects on sows of poor nutrition is. Right? There's an increased culling rate. It used to be you would assume 25, 30% turnover of your sow herd per year. Now, you're about 50%, 60% turnover of your sow herd. Clearly, that's an indication that we're not feeding those sows properly. It's not just management, it's nutrition. Increased death loss. Having worked in lots of farrowing barns, right, and done lots of baby pig and sow research, I can tell you the worst job I can possibly think of is dragging a dead sow out of a crate. And this happens not uncommonly. Increased variability of pigs. Ryan's already talked about that. And all of these things lead to an increased overall cost of the sow herd. I mean, economics is top of mind everybody you talk to. And we're living with a greater cost to our sow herds than we need to. That's because our knowledge of sow nutrition has not kept pace with the changes in productivity. NRC recognized this in the 1998 recommendations. Up until that time, and they had been for 50 years, constant feed allowance, same feed intake throughout gestation, constant amino acid intake, and use the energy values and digestibilities from grower pigs, which we still do. 2012, they came out with a new model, clearly recommended increased energy and amino acids in late gestation. There's a lot of improvements in this, and towards the end of my talk, I'm going to talk about what I think are still some of the weaknesses in that model. So what are those metabolic changes that we need to be feeding to meat? McPherson showed this is the protein in the fetus. There's very little fetal growth until about 70 or 80 days, and then it just goes up here at a tremendous rate. So in those last 30 days, that last trimester, it goes from about 20 grams of protein up to over 200. 10-fold increase in piglet protein in the last 30 days. A 10-fold increase. That's huge. How can you feed a sow the same feed intake at this period and expect those piglets to grow? Mammary gland growth. Huge jump here, and then another big jump here. This is heat production. Heat production, it's a little higher here because they were being fed to recover from lactation weight loss. And then big increase in heat production here as they're doing all of that hard work. It's hard work to grow 15 piglets. So the heat production of that sow has to go up. I plotted this based upon a whole lot of our data in the sows. These are sows fed to gain about 40 or 45 kilos during gestation. And there's a lot of commercial operations that feed for less growth than that. Here's changes in fetal weight gain based upon some of that data I showed you. If you take fetal weight gain and you take that away from this is what is happening to the sow. Her growth rate slows down as the growth rate of the piglets is increasing. She's about a plateau here, and then she's negative. And all of our data on protein synthesis, protein breakdown, amino acid oxidation, and heat production show that our sows gaining 45 kilos, more than 300 grams a day, are catabolic before they even farrow. We're sending sows into the toughest part of their life when they are catabolic and trying to feed 15 baby pigs, already on the downswing. They're already catabolic. They're breaking down protein. They're breaking down fat to grow the piglets. So, if you believe what I've said, why didn't we just change these things? Why didn't we change them a long time ago? It's really tough to do when you don't have very much data. For gestating sows, there are 20 estimates in 50 years. There's only one estimate ever for methionine in gestating pigs. One ever in the world. 4 estimates of threonine. You can make that 5 now with ours. And 1 estimate for tryptophan. That's ours that we've just finished. So compared to literally thousands of papers on lysine requirements in grow-finished pigs. And the reason is that it's difficult. It's not easy to do research in sows. It's very time-consuming because you need your outcome, right, is 3.5 months down the road. And we know that the impacts on this gestation carry over and follow into the next gestation. So you really need to study those pigs for 2 gestation cycles. If you're going to measure pigs per litter and standard outcome measurements and weight changes, you need 100 sows to measure a difference of 1 more live pig at weaning. That's just statistics per treatment. How many people can afford to do that? How many people can afford to take that time to get 1 number? And the fact that they're constantly changing, right? So you need to feed different phases if you're really going to study it well. And you just don't learn much from simple measurements. So when I started looking at this problem, we decided to take a totally different approach to measuring requirements in sows. And we chose to use amino acid oxidation. So we put an isotope tracer in the feed, so an amino acid with a carbon label, a carbon 13, a stable isotope label. We feed it to them, we collect the breath, and we can measure the enrichment of that carbon label, and we can tell how much of that amino acid was retained in protein and how much was oxidized and used. One day you can do that. So in 2 to 3 weeks, I can take a sow and repeat her every 3 days, and at the end of 2 weeks, I can tell you that sow's requirement for lysine is X. And then I can do a group of sows, actually, within about 3 weeks. And by energy, we used indirect calorimetry. You should be familiar with that. A classic measurement, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and breath. Measured every minute over 24 hours. You get the energy requirement for the same day as you're measuring amino acid oxidation. Rapid and precise. So these are the methods we apply. They're expensive. You need the technology. You need the people who can do it. You need a $500,000 piece of equipment just to measure the breath. Luckily, I have a friend who has that. This is the cages that we put the sow in. This is plexiglass built around a farrowing crate, and places for the air to come in, places for the feed and for the water to feed the sows in here. And actually this, we can unbolt that and bolt on a box where we can put the litter in, and we can study a sow during lactation also. And then we measure oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production, and we measure methane. If you want to get actual carbon balance, you have to measure methane. Pigs actually produce quite a lot of methane from both ends of the pig. So what we've done, we've measured lysine and threonine, the maintenance requirements, so unbred sows. And then during gestation, lysine, threonine, isoleucine, and tryptophan. Measured them all both at early gestation, between day 25 and 50, and at late gestation between 85 and about 110 days. In every experiment, we have a minimum of 6 levels for each amino acid. Every sow receives every amino acid level. And many times the same sow, well, the same sows are always used in early and late gestation. And some of these sows were actually used in both 2nd, 3rd, and 4th parity. So we have parity effects in a number of our sows. This is the metabolic data, kind of the overall data. Sows here gaining 2nd parity, gaining about 45 kilos, 3rd parity about 40 kilos, 4th parity sows about 25 kilos. This is protein deposition in grams per day. Look at this huge difference. In early gestation, they're depositing about 32 grams a day of protein. Late gestation, they're depositing 126. Right? That's a huge difference. Parity 3, 38 to 120. Parity 4, only 4. They're growing very slowly now, right? But still about 64 in late gestation. This is retained energy. 3 megajoules per day in early gestation, negative 0.7 in late gestation. 1.2, negative 0.9. 1.5, negative 1.3. These sows receiving 2.5 kilos of diet are in negative energy balance. They are breaking down body fat to provide the energy to grow those piglets. And they are breaking down also body protein because we're not feeding that much protein. At 2.5 kilos, that's not enough protein to provide that much protein deposition. She's actually breaking protein down and redepositing it in the fetus. Here's an example of our requirement. I'm not going to show you all the individual data. This is Ryan Samuel. Ryan, put up your hand. Ryan Samuel back there, now a scientist with Alltech, PhD student of mine. This is part of his thesis work. And Merlin was generous enough to come up to Alberta and serve as an examiner on that. Early gestation, about 10 grams per day. Late gestation, 16. More than 50% difference. You can't feed the same diet and get those two. Threonine requirement. Where's Crystal? Crystal, put up your hand. There's Crystal Levesque, another PhD student. This is part of her data. Crystal is now assistant professor at University of South Dakota and continuing to do work on sows. This is threonine in early gestation with both plasma and oxidation, between 4 and 5 grams per day in early gestation. Late gestation, we're looking at about 11 to 12 grams per day. Again, more than a twofold change. Not 50% for lysine. It was a twofold change for threonine. Huge change. This summarizes all of those amino acids. So this data, this is first, second parity, third and fourth parity, and this is the new NRC 2012. We're a little bit higher here, but we're much higher in late gestation. For threonine, we're lower, but we're much higher. Tryptophan, we're lower, and here we're, well, about the same. These are probably not different. Our measurement error is within 1 gram. Here, we're lower, and then we're about the same. Here, we're lower. Here, we're certainly higher. So that's compared to the new NRC model. And here's isoleucine, right? We're lower, and then we're higher. That's typically most of what our results are, is that we're lower than the NRC model for early gestation, but we're higher for late gestation. I just want you to look at this data. This is the lysine-threonine ratio based upon our measured data. 53, 74, 62, 95. The key message here is, because those ratios are so different, you cannot take the same diet that you fed in early gestation and feed more of it in late gestation to meet those requirements without a whole lot of waste. You need a second diet if you're really going to meet the requirements properly without overfeeding. Now, we developed a prediction equation where we input all of our data. We have about 400 data points: sow body weight, weight gain during gestation, weight loss during the lactation, and weight change during the previous gestation, litter weight, all our interactions, and we compared that actual to our actual observed requirements in individual sows. A p-value of 0.001 and an r-squared of 0.9. So this is the predicted on the lines, and all the marks are the individual measurements on sows. With this, really quite impressive response. The reason I show you this, now this is not a model, this is a prediction equation. A model requires all that fundamental metabolism and the algorithms that describe their change. This is simply a prediction equation based upon the output measurements, right, that you get as a sum of all the metabolism of the sow. but it agrees with our observed data very well. I think you have to agree. So what that means is, if our estimates where we're lower than NRC or higher than NRC, if they were wrong because of our methodology or something else that was different, you wouldn't have a p-value of 0.001 and r squared of 0.9. Because our measurements then meant they would not be accurately reflecting the sum of the metabolism of the sow, which you measure with things like weight gain and litter growth, et cetera, et cetera. But it does. And that gives me confidence that, in fact, our measurements are good. They're not perfect, but they describe very well the underlying metabolism of that sow. So now I want to talk about models. There's several models out there published about sows. This is the German model. They only give values only. They don't actually give you the model. The people that put the model together didn't want to share it. But they used the model and generated a whole series of tables of data which you can use. It was previously only available in German, but thankfully Sönke Moon works for me, right, who was born in Germany, and he could read it before anybody else in North America could. Now it's available in English. Dormad and INRA has got one, and they did it all based on gilts. Kim has got one also based on gilts, and then the NRC one for 2012, which covers all sows. Broadly similar agreements in a number of areas. We all agree that requirements are much higher in late gestation for both energy and amino acids. We agree that the requirement declines as the sow ages and stops growing. We agree that the energy requirement seems to max out at about third parity, and then it plateaus after that. But there are a lot of differences in the many actual requirement values. So now I'd like to give you my take on the NRC model. And I know from talking at Coffee Break, there's a couple people here who are quite interested in that model. So they recognize that amino acid and energy requirement changes with days of pregnancy, weight and age of the sow, changes from parity, number of piglets born, the piglet birth weight, environmental conditions. And Lee Johnson later in the next talk is going to talk about environmental conditions and the effects of group housing and temperature in different barns and how that affects. You need to add more energy just to compensate for that. And this model allows you to do that. I think these values are quite correct. Protein deposition per megacal of ME increases from day 1 to 30, right, to late gestation, from 10.4 to about 46 grams. What that means is that a change in the ratio of protein to energy during deposition. If there's a change in the ratio of energy to protein during gestation, that again means you cannot take the early gestation diet and feed more of it in late gestation and expect to get a positive response. That's been done. People see either no response or negative responses. This is one of the reasons. Because the ratio changes. You're actually throwing the ratio off by feeding too much of the first phase diet. Based upon the fact that fetal growth takes precedence over maternal growth, the fetus has much more protein relative to fat in the sow and very little lipid. Now the weaknesses. So that was 2 positives. I got about 10 on weaknesses. Some of them are just quibbles, though. One of the things I think that could be improved in the future is it uses energy intake as an input. It does not allow the user to define how much growth they want in the sow, how much, and then our body composition change, and allow you to do that. That's one of the German model does allow you to do that. So it doesn't predict energy intake necessary for a specific outcome or body composition. I think in the future, I would suggest they consider trying to do that. In late pregnancy, maternal protein deposition increases linearly with no upper limit. For one thing, I think it should increase curvilinearly as part of the figure that we'll look at, figure 8.5. Part of it's curvilinear, right? Part of it's linear. Probably all should be curvilinear. And that there is a PD max, older sows Older sows actually have a PD max. The model assumes a constant increase, right, of protein deposition during gestation. Therefore, the amino acid requirement must change with changes in energy intake. So again, you can't alter the body composition by increasing protein deposition with limited or no energy, right? And you can't increase energy retained in fat without increasing protein deposition. So it could be improved by adding a starting weight, body composition, and allowing you to calculate that. All right, here is the very key information about that model. Figure 8.5. Have you ever seen a sow grow like this? Suddenly decline, a little plateau, a slow increase, oh, big jump, and then we take off on a straight line. Metabolically, that simply cannot describe a sow. That's not what happens. I mean, all you have to, if you work in the sows at all, you know that physiologically this does not describe what really happens in a sow during growth and gestation. And those who work on the model, people like Dave Delang and Merlin was involved, and many others, and Lai Adiola, recognize that. But this is what the data say. It's not a fault of the modelers. This is a fault of the data. We simply lack quality data in sows to create a really good model. And that was, I believe, my understanding was the decision to leave it look like this, was to say to everybody out there, you need to collect better data in sows so that we can give you a better model. And that's the clear message here. There's another curve here that we're going to look at. This one is protein deposition that is time dependent. Time-dependent protein deposition. That represents the protein deposition that was observed in nitrogen balance studies but could not be allocated to any known PD factors. Therefore, it's a residual value that is unexplained. It was observed, but they couldn't tie it in any way to maternal growth, fetal growth, conceptus growth, all of those things that grow protein. But it was there in the end data. So they put it in as time. So it's simply an unexplained factor. Again, a key message that we need better data in sows. I think that's a result of several potential errors. One is measurement of nitrogen balance. I'm going to piss some of you off. Nitrogen balance is a historical measure from 50 years ago. It should be treated as an archaic measure of historical interest only. There are simply too many things wrong with the collection of nitrogen balance for it to be used quantitatively in the 2000s. And I'm sure some of you would love to argue with me. So they were conducted at constant feed intake with overfeeding in early and mid-gestation, underfeeding in late gestation. That's going to affect all of the shape of those curves. And it didn't take into account body recovery post-lactation. Some of that PD time could be compensatory growth for body protein recovery in those sows post-weaning. It's also calculated from the estimated change in body protein content. That applies that it's not associated with lipid deposition, and therefore it forces protein and lipid deposition ratio to change with an unexplained measurement. So that's a problem. Although I agree protein lipid deposition will change during gestation, or you may want it to change, right? It shouldn't be linked to an unexplained factor. But again, that's a failure in the underlying data that's available to work with. It was applied in gilts. It was derived from gilts, but it was applied to all sows all the way up to fifth parity. So I think because the requirements of gilts are quite different, I think that probably wasn't a valid assumption, but again, a lack of data. In older sows, there's really no recognition for the protein that was lost during lactation and then must be regained in those first 30 days or so, or regained during that gestation period. So it should be accounted for separately because it's highly variable. Some herds lose a lot of weight during gestation, some breeds, right? Some feeding programs. The pigs that we actually have, we have sows, most of our sows gain weight from farrowing through to the end of lactation. And they all breed just like that. They have a tremendous appetite. We just happen to have a line of sows that has a tremendous appetite, and they pig out during lactation. We got gals there eating 12 and 15 kilos by the end of lactation. Tremendous feed intake. They're actually gaining weight. But that's not the norm. A lot of sows lose weight, and you need to take that into account. I think it would be a real strength in future models to actually be able to account for this. And because it is a type of compensatory gain, the efficiency factor for protein deposition that goes into the algorithms probably should be different. But we don't have data on this. Somebody needs to get that data. Conceptus gain remains constant even if you change feed intake. I don't think that's true. I think Conceptus protein deposition should increase for large litters and late pregnancy. Small litters, probably no problem. If you got 10, 11, 12 pigs, probably no problem. But if you've got sows dropping 15 pigs, I think an increased feed intake in late gestation is going to be associated with an increased growth of piglets. So I think we need to, this constant value would need to be adjusted. Again, that's the underlying algorithm. Here's one I don't understand. The model uses about 5 grams of lysine per 100 gram of body protein for fetuses. But everywhere else in the data, a growing pig is 7 grams. That's the value we use for every other pig, right? From postnatally all the way through, 7 grams of lysine per 100 grams of body protein. The program here is using 5 because there was data that said it was 5. I don't think that data could be right. I mean, it just doesn't seem right to me that it could be 5 when every other pig is 7. So I just don't understand why that fetus should be different. If it's true, if this is not different, right, if it is 7 but they're using 5, that means the model underestimates lysine requirement. However, when you compare the model's estimate of lysine requirement to the actual values, right, you come out with the number that agrees with actual measured values. This can only happen 2 ways. Either the factor used for efficiency of lysine deposition during gestation must be incorrect, or the model was forced to agree with empirical estimates of lysine requirement. And if you read the text carefully, there is a sentence in there that says the model did not accurately predict some of the estimated requirements, and the model was forced to agree with empirical estimates so that it would accurately provide an estimate of lysine requirement. Again, this is not a fault of the modelers or the people in the NRC committee. This is a fault in the data that's available for them to work with. So all of that said, how should we feed sows? There's tables in my paper where I actually tell you how many grams of lysine, how many grams per day, and how many megajoules extra that you should be feeding through the sows. And you can look at those data directly. But I suggest parity segregated phase feeding would be the optimal. You only need 2 diets on farm. You formulate 1 diet for the lowest possible sow requirements, 4th or 5th parity sows, right? And then you formulate another diet for the highest possible requirements, which would be a gilt in late gestation. And with electronic sow feeders, right? Even in gestation sow stall housing, you run a second feed line and adjust your drops, and you could blend feed those 2 feeds and feed every sow an individually designed mix that would accurately meet her nutrient requirements. So you can feed them proportionally for every pig in the herd. Or you can use 2 compromised diets. You could formulate a low diet and a high diet, and then simply change diets at about day 85. Day 85 is our recommendation. It would minimize overfeeding and underfeeding, change from the low diet to the high diet, and feed that all the way through to farrowing. So that's another approach. It's a little simpler. There will be some over and underfeeding as a result of that. Or you could feed a low diet and simply top dress. Labor's cheap. You feed the low diet, and then you have somebody go through and add an extra scoop on top of those sows, for those sows that are in late gestation. A simple approach, but an improved approach from what we've been doing currently. So the benefits of this parity segregated phase feeding, you will supply nutrients for all sows at all stages in the correct ratios and amounts. Sows will be in better body condition entering lactation. There'll be better rebreeding success. If sows are not catabolic already going into lactation, you've given them a step up already. Probably, this takes a couple of years to collect this data, but probably I believe there'll be increased sow longevity. 1 more litter per sow before they were culled from the herd is a huge economic impact. That saves you the cost of $250, $300 for replacement gilt. If you can drop your culling rate by 10%, wow, add that up real quick, and any herd of any size, that's a lot of money. And there's reduced feed costs because you're reducing both the underfeeding and the overfeeding. It's at least $10 per sow per year, right? If you only got 100 sows, not a bother. If you got 1,000 sows, it's time to think about it. 100,000 sows, you damn well better be doing this. So, how are you going to feed sows? Are you going to go back and feed those sows on one diet all the way through gestation? Because if you are next year, I'm going to come back and kick your ass all the way to the house. So I hope I guess that means I should quit. All right, in summary, amino acid requirements are much higher in late than early gestation. The energy requirements, the data is in the table there. Parity segregated phase feeding, the ideal tool to supply nutrients in the right amounts, and very clear production and financial benefits. Thanks to Ajinomoto for supplying the amino acids and these other groups for supplying the cash. Thank you very much.